They barely noticed her when she walked in. No cameras followed her. No whispers of importance trailed behind her. Just a quiet woman in a faded coat, holding a worn leather bag close to her side, standing near the back of a crowded room where everyone else seemed louder, sharper, more confident. She looked like someone people had learned to ignore their whole lives. And that was the first mistake, because what no one in that room understood was that this moment, this ordinary-looking moment, was about to turn into something none of them would ever forget. The room buzzed with low conversation, the kind that fills the air when people think nothing important is happening yet. A few people laughed. Someone checked their phone. Someone else rolled their eyes impatiently, clearly convinced this would be quick, boring, and forgettable. She stood there silently, waiting. When her name was finally called, the tone used wasn't respectful. It wasn't careful. It was rushed, almost annoyed, as if she were an inconvenience delaying something more important. She stepped forward calmly, her face unreadable, her posture straight but unassuming. No nerves, no panic, just patience. The man in charge glanced at her briefly, and then looked away, already forming an opinion before she had spoken a single word. He leaned back slightly, confident, comfortable in the authority he believed was unquestionable. "State your name," he said, not bothering to look up again. She did. Her voice was steady, clear, polite. There was nothing dramatic about it. No trembling, no hesitation, and yet, for reasons no one could quite explain later, a few people in the room felt an odd shift in the air, like something important was being missed. The questions started quickly, sharp, dismissive, each one delivered with the assumption that the answers wouldn't matter much anyway. She answered every single one calmly. No attitude, no excuses, no emotional outbursts. That only seemed to irritate him more. People like him weren't used to calm defiance. They expected fear, apologies, desperation. When those didn't come, they mistook composure for weakness. He sighed loudly, glancing around the room as if to signal that he was wasting his time. "So let me get this straight," he said. "You expect us to believe that this situation wasn't entirely your fault?" She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply explained, slowly, clearly, with the kind of precision that comes from someone who knows exactly what they're talking about. That's when the smirks began. A few people exchanged looks. One person quietly laughed. Another shook their head as if thinking, "Here we go again." He cut her off mid-sentence. "I've heard enough," he said sharply. The room went quiet. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to continue, then stopped, not because she was intimidated, but because she recognized something most people miss in moments like this. The decision had already been made, and it wasn't in her favor. He leaned forward now, eyes cold, voice firm. "Based on what I've heard, and considering the circumstances, I'm issuing a penalty." A pause, a deliberate one, the kind designed to feel powerful. $10,000. The words hit the room like a slap. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "That's insane." Another person muttered something under their breath. $10,000 for someone like her. It sounded devastating. People immediately began making assumptions. How could she pay that? Where would she get it? Was this the moment she would finally break? But she didn't. She didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She didn't beg. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a statement, not a punishment. That unsettled him. "Do you understand the penalty?" he asked, clearly expecting resistance. "Now, yes," she said. Just one word. Calm. Control. The room felt strange suddenly. Too quiet. Too still. He frowned. "Do you have anything else to say?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of irritation, as if daring her to challenge him. She paused. Not dramatically, not nervously. Just long enough to choose her words carefully. "Yes," she said softly, "I do." A few heads turned. He raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Make it quick." She reached into her worn leather bag. That's when people started paying attention, not because of what she pulled out at first, but because of how she did it. No rush, no shaking hands, no hesitation. She placed a document on the table, then another. Then another. Neatly, precisely, the sound of paper hitting the surface echoed louder than it should have. He glanced down, irritated. What is this supposed to be? He asked. She met his eyes for the first time, and in that moment, something changed. I believe, she said evenly, you may want to review those before finalizing your decision. The confidence in her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It was absolute. He scoffed lightly, flipping through the papers with visible impatience. Then he stopped. His expression shifted, just slightly at first. A pause that lasted a second longer than expected. He flipped back a page, read it again. The room leaned in without realizing it. Someone whispered, "What is it?" His jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. "These documents," he began, then stopped again. He looked up at her. Then back down, then up again. "You didn't mention this earlier," he said. "You didn't allow me to finish earlier," she replied politely. The room went completely silent. You could hear someone breathing. Near the back, he straightened in his chair. "These credentials," he said slowly, "are extensive." She nodded once. "For the record," she said calmly. "I have spent over 3 decades teaching, researching, and advising in this exact field." Murmurs exploded instantly. No way. Did she just say decades? Teaching? His face drained of color. He flipped to another page, and another. Each one seemed to make him smaller. "You're telling me," he said, his voice no longer sharp, "that you are—" "Yes," she said. "I am." Someone near the front gasped out loud. The realization hit the room all at once. She wasn't just knowledgeable. She wasn't just experienced. She was one of the most qualified people who could possibly be standing there. The irony was crushing. The man who had dismissed her, interrupted her, fined her without listening, had just publicly exposed his own ignorance. He shifted uncomfortably. "I was not aware," he said. "That much is clear," she replied, still calm, still respectful. He cleared his throat again, suddenly aware of every eye in the room. "The penalty may need to be reconsidered," he said. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply waited. He reviewed the documents again, slower now, more carefully, the confidence gone, replaced by caution. The power dynamic had flipped completely. What was once arrogance had turned into embarrassment. What was once silence had turned into judgment, not against her, against him. "I believe," he said finally, "that a mistake may have been made." A few people nodded quietly, others crossed their arms, watching closely. She spoke again, her voice steady. "I never asked for special treatment," she said, "only to be heard." The words landed heavier than any accusation. He swallowed. "Yes," he said quietly, "of course." The penalty was withdrawn, the decision reversed. But the damage had already been done, not to her, to him. As she gathered her documents and placed them back into her bag, people parted slightly to let her pass. Some looked embarrassed, some looked inspired, some looked stunned. She walked out the same way she came in. Quietly, calmly, without seeking validation. But the room she left behind was not the same one she entered, because every single person there had just witnessed a powerful truth, that authority without humility is dangerous, that assumptions are costly, and that underestimating someone based on appearance, age, or silence can lead to regret you never saw coming. Some lessons don't need shouting. Some don't need punishment. They simply unfold, and once they do, there's no folding them back. What most people never realized was that the story didn't end when she walked out of that room. In fact, that was only the beginning, because the silence she left behind wasn't ordinary silence. It wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was the kind of quiet that forces people to confront themselves, the kind that makes confidence feel suddenly fragile. For a long moment after she left, no one spoke. The man who had issued the fine sat there, staring at the empty space where she had been standing. His hands rested on the surface in front of him, but they no longer looked steady. He shifted slightly in his seat, aware now that every small movement was being watched. He cleared his throat again. "Next case," he said, but his voice didn't carry the same authority anymore. People could feel it. The energy in the room had changed. What once felt routine now felt uncomfortable. Eyes drifted back to him, not with respect, but with quiet judgment. A woman in the audience leaned toward the person next to her and whispered, He never even listened. Another replied softly. He already decided. Those words spread faster than anyone expected. By the time the session ended, the story had already begun to travel. Outside, people gathered in small clusters, talking in hushed tones, replaying what they had just witnessed. Some were angry, others were embarrassed, realizing how easily they had made the same assumptions he had, and some were inspired. Because what they had seen wasn't just someone being underestimated. They had seen restraint. They had seen patience. They had seen power without aggression. She stepped outside into the daylight, the door closing quietly behind her. The air felt different out there, lighter, free. She took a slow breath, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. A few people noticed her and hesitated, unsure whether to speak. One man finally stepped forward. "I just wanted to say," he began awkwardly. "That was impressive." She smiled politely. "Thank you," she said, then paused. "But it shouldn't have been necessary." He nodded, not knowing what else to say. She walked on. What none of them knew was that she had lived moments like this before. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Rooms where people assumed. Situations where voices like hers were dismissed until credentials appeared. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely changes minds. Letting truth speak for itself does. Later, that evening, her phone buzzed out then again and again. Messages from colleagues, former students, friends who had already heard fragments of the story. "Was that really you? I can't believe what happened. Are you okay?" She responded to a few, ignored the rest. She wasn't interested in attention. She never had been. But attention had a way of finding stories like this. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. Short videos, reactions, commentary. People paused the footage at the exact moment his expression changed, analyzing it frame by frame. They shared screenshots of the documents he had overlooked. They debated not her qualifications, but his behavior. One comment stood out among thousands. He punished her because he thought he could. That sentence captured everything. The discussion grew louder. Some defended him, claiming it was a misunderstanding. Others pointed out that misunderstandings don't happen when people listen. A former student of hers posted a long message. "She taught me that the law isn't about power. It's about responsibility." Watching this hurt, but watching her handle it reminded me why I chose this path. The post went viral. And with it, the story reached places no one in that room could have imagined. The man at the center of it all watched it unfold from behind closed doors. He didn't comment. He didn't explain. He simply watched. Every replay of that moment felt heavier than the last. The way he had leaned back, the way he had interrupted, the confidence he had worn like armor, now cracked beyond repair. For the first time in a long while, he questioned himself, not publicly, privately. And that question lingered longer than any fine ever could. Days later, a formal statement was released. It spoke of professionalism, of procedures, of reflection, but it didn't mention her by name. She didn't need it to, because the message had already been delivered far more clearly than any apology could manage. Meanwhile, she returned to her routine: lectures, research, quiet mornings, with coffee and notes spread across her desk. Life went on, steady and familiar, except now. When she stood in front of a room, her students listened differently. They didn't just hear theory. They heard experience. They heard proof. One student raised a hand after class. "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Of course." "How did you stay so calm?" She smiled slightly. "Because I knew who I was," she replied, "and I didn't need to prove it by raising my voice." That answer stayed with them. The story eventually faded from headlines, as stories always do. Something new replaced it, something louder, something messier. But for those who witnessed it, in person or through a screen, it never really disappeared, because it wasn't just a story about authority being wrong. It was a reminder that silence doesn't mean ignorance, that humility matters, that the most dangerous mistakes are the ones made when we stop listening, and that truth, when given time, always unfolds. Long after the online noise faded, something subtle continued to ripple outward. People who had never met her began to recognize themselves in the room that day. They replayed moments in their own lives when they had dismissed someone too quickly, when they had spoken over a quieter voice, when they had assumed authority meant correctness. One man wrote that he remembered cutting off his own mother during a disagreement, convinced he knew better simply because he spoke louder. A woman admitted she had laughed at a coworker who dressed simply. Never imagining the depth of experience behind her silence, the story became a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable. In places far from that room, conversations began that had nothing to do with fines or authority, but everything to do with listening. Teachers replayed the moment for their classes. Managers quietly reconsidered how they spoke to their teams. Parents shared it with their children, not as entertainment, but as a lesson. Meanwhile, she remained largely out of sight. She didn't give interviews. She didn't accept invitations to speak about the incident. When colleagues asked why, she answered simply, "The moment wasn't about me." But privately, she reflected, not with anger. With clarity, she remembered her early years, walking into rooms where her presence was questioned before her words were heard. She remembered mentors who had told her that knowledge alone wasn't enough. Patience would be her greatest tool. At the time, she hadn't understood why. Now she did. One afternoon, weeks later, she received a handwritten letter. No return address. Inside, the message was brief. "I didn't listen when I should have. I am learning to now." There was no signature. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a book on her shelf, marking the page without writing a single note. For her, that was enough. Across the city, the man who had once felt untouchable moved through his days differently. Meetings felt heavier. Decisions took longer. He caught himself hesitating before speaking, replaying moments where silence might have served him better. Power had once felt automatic. Now it felt conditional. He began asking more questions, allowing more space, not because he feared another moment like that, but because he finally understood how easily one could happen. Some noticed the change, others did in single quotes. Change, when it's real, rarely announces itself. Months passed. The story resurfaced unexpectedly one evening when a panel discussion referenced it in passing. Not names, not details, just the moment. An authority figure confronted by the truth they ignored. The audience leaned in. Someone asked, "Do you think moments like that actually change people?" The speaker paused. "Only if they're willing to sit with the discomfort," they said. "Most aren't, but some are." Back at her university, a new semester began. Students filled the lecture hall, buzzing with conversation, unaware that many of them had chosen this class because of a story they'd seen online. She entered quietly, setting her bag down as usual. The room slowly fell silent. She looked up, scanning faces, young, eager, uncertain. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to make something clear." They leaned forward. "Knowledge doesn't make you powerful," she continued. "Listening does." No one spoke, and in that stillness, something settled. The lesson wasn't written on the board. It wasn't part of the syllabus, but it stayed. Years from now, when some of those students would sit in positions of authority themselves, that moment would return to them, not as a viral clip, but as a quiet internal check. Am I listening? That question, once learned, never really goes away. The world continued spinning. New stories replaced old ones. Attention shifted, as it always does. But every now and then, someone would stumble across the clip late at night, watch it without context, and feel that familiar tightening in their chest as the truth revealed itself again. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't heard until it was almost too late. And somewhere, without knowing who was watching or why, she would be living her life exactly as she always had, steady, thoughtful, unremarkable to those who still judged quickly. Until the moment truth unfolded.